When it comes to creation versus evolution, there is this notion out there that you have to be fully committed to either side of the debate. However, I do not think that this should be the case, and I hold the view that the evolutionists do have a point, but only up until a certain point. I think debating over this topic would be easier if both sides were just to admit that they have biased views that persuade them into believing either one of the sides. And if they were just to admit sometimes that the other side has a good argument. So today, I want to talk about why I only partially believe in evolution and what the consequences of that belief is. Before we begin though, I want to give you a few disclaimers for this video. Wherever you fall on this issue doesn't make you more or less a Christian, because as we all know, being a Christian is giving your life to Jesus and accepting Him as your Savior. So, since this issue is not the Gospels, it shouldn't split the church. Instead, we should just evaluate the claims like I'm going to do today, and then you need to take your own position on this topic. It is still a very important issue and we need to talk about it, which is why I'm making this video. Also, my arguments will mostly be philosophical in the sense that I'm going to use logic and questions in order to show my point. However, I will be sharing some articles that I found that prove my points. If you disagree with something that I'm going to say in this video, then I would love to hear about it in the comments and we can have a constructive conversation about it. And lastly, I just want to say that I am very open to changing my mind on this topic. So with all of the disclaimers out of the way, let's get started with the main problem of this video. Evolution. Firstly, I want to quickly tell you a story about how I got to this point in my life. Evolution was probably one of the biggest topics that got me to the point I am today. You see, about 3 or 4 years ago, I started watching Kent Hovind a lot. All of the videos and debates I watched of him have gotten me to not just only think about the problem of evolution and the Bible, but have also gotten me to think about the whole Bible. When I first started watching Kent Hovind, I had a really strong opinion about evolution. But as I started getting to know the arguments a bit better, I realized that a very strong view on evolution is very easy to refute. So as I started doing more and more research into this topic, I realized that I needed a more flexible view on this topic. And as it turns out, everything that we observe in science is still compatible with the Bible. It can even explain some things in the Bible that are difficult to understand without this knowledge. Okay, let's now start talking about evolution. To start off, let's get a basic definition of evolution. If you do a simple Google search, you will see the following 2 definitions. The process by which different kinds of living organisms are believed to have developed from earlier forms during the history of the Earth. Or the gradual development of something. Okay, so here is the main issue that you will see come up throughout this video. The main problem I have with the modern idea of evolution is the fact that they always try to mix in things that we know to be true with things that we don't know to be true, but what they believe to be true. And usually, a distinction between these 2 things are not made in a debate, which makes it very difficult to argue over. If we take a look at the first definition, to understand it, you need to know what an earlier form is. Because with just this definition, evolution is very compatible with the Bible. Because I can simply say that the earlier forms of the animals that exist today are the kinds that were created by God during the 6 days of creation. For example, God created one kind of elephant in the 6 days of creation, and all the species of elephants that we have on Earth today have developed from this one kind of elephant. However, if you take a look at how science interprets this, they take this idea even further and say that everything that lives on Earth today comes from a common ancestor, which by this definition is also compatible. So this definition is obviously not good enough. So let's try to find some better definitions. To do this, let's first look at how the idea of evolution came about. The idea of evolution started with a guy named Charles Darwin in 1859. In 1831, Darwin went on a voyage. And on this voyage, he would go on to study nature and all different kinds of animals for 5 years. In particular, Darwin would end up going to the Galapagos Islands. What he discovered there gave him the idea of evolution as we know it today. He saw on these islands that every island had finches. However, the beaks of the finches were different depending on what was available to eat on that island. So on one island you would have finches with beaks that are adapted to eat seed. On another island these finches' beaks would be adapted to eat insects, and so on and so forth. But what Darwin realized there was that all of these finches came from a common ancestor. So there probably was this population of finches that moved to the Galapagos Islands. The finches that had beaks adapted for eating seed would stay on the seed island. The rest would then go on to live on the other islands, following the same process. When Darwin got home after this voyage, he would go on to research this idea for another 20 years. And after discovering that Alfred Russel Wallace was researching the same thing, they met up and discussed this topic. That would then lead to Darwin releasing his famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. This book, in Darwin's time, would not be viewed as the revolutionary book that it is being viewed as today, because this book would fundamentally challenge religious people's beliefs. And that is still a problem up and until today. As I will explain, I am of the opinion that Darwin did excellent work with his book. However, he and all of the scientists that eventually took on his view took what he discovered on these islands a bit too far into a realm where things get fuzzy. So, what did his book actually say? Well, Darwin made the claim that all life was descended from a common ancestor, much like the tree of life diagrams that we see today. And I think they even found some of these trees that Darwin himself drew to explain his ideas. It is important to note that he never made a claim about the origin of life, and I agree that that should be a separate issue. So it's important to recognize that the origin of life, the Big Bang, and evolution are three different ideas that do not depend on each other. Although, I think that if you're an atheist, you need to at least admit that these three things need to work together in order for you to have a proper theory of how life got into existence. Now, what I want you to remember throughout this video is that Darwin got these ideas from observing different species of finches on islands. How you can go from that observation to saying that all life is related and descended from a common ancestor is honestly beyond my capabilities of understanding. Now, lastly, I want to quickly take a look at an article I found by Stanford University which explains a little bit more of evolution, and I think they did a great job of summing it up. So I just want to point out a few things that I read in this article. Under definitions of evolution, we read the following. Although the work of Charles Darwin is usually the starting point for contemporary understanding of evolution, interestingly, he does not use the term in the first edition of On the Origin of Species, referring instead to descent with modification. Now, this is exactly where my main problem lies with this idea. Descent with modification is the only thing that Darwin observed, and it is also the only thing that any scientist in the history of the world has ever observed. Animals are modified descendants of their parents. Taking that then to mean that all animals on Earth are related through a common ancestor, I think is a step that's just too big to take. I agree that descent with modification is a real thing that we do observe. However, I just don't agree that you can take that and say that all animals have to be related because of that. If you read a bit further, you will see that with modern gene theory, a new definition was obtained. This yielded a prevalent, probably the most prevalent, understanding of evolution as any change in the frequency of alleles within a population from one generation to the next. Google gives the following definition for an allele: each of two or more alternative forms of a gene that arise by mutation and are found at the same place on a chromosome. So, from gene theory, we know that the genes change from one generation to the next. And this is why, for example, you look a lot like your parents, although you don't look exactly like them. So you might have some of the same features, like for example the mouth shape, the nose shape, the ear shape, etc. However, you do look different because your genes that code for those things are different. What I thought was a very interesting thing to note is that this definition is exactly the same definition that we got from just a simple Google search. But instead of using simplistic language, they just used gene theory language to give the same definition in more scientific terms, I guess. So again, with this definition, my God hypothesis works just as well as your common ancestor hypothesis. When you notice this, you will realize that both sides have to believe in something that happened in the past, because from these definitions, both cases are equally likely. So you would have to weigh up the evidence that's being brought by both sides, and then decide for yourself which one of the sides has more compelling evidence and which one of the sides makes more sense in terms of what we observe. Note, however, that this definition refers to evolution only in a microevolutionary context, and thus doesn't reference the emergence of new species and their characteristics, although it is intended to underlie those macroevolutionary changes. It is essential to understand that biologists recognize many ways that evolution can occur, evolution by natural selection being just one of them, although it is often held to be the most prevalent one. Evolution can also occur through genetic drift, mutation, or migration. It can also occur through sexual selection, which some consider to be a form of natural selection and others consider to be distinct from natural selection. Evolutionary theory, then, can be taken to be the study of these and other modes of evolution. Okay, so that is all I wanted to point out with this article. Now that we have a better understanding of what evolution is, let's take a deeper look into the problems that I've already highlighted to you. Firstly, what a lot of people assume is that if you are a religious person who does not believe in evolution, then you go against everything that science says and you are ignoring all of the obvious facts just so that you can keep your belief in that religion. However, as I pointed out, this is not a central issue in Christianity, and I would therefore totally jump on the wagon if I get compelling evidence. But that won't change my mind on whether Christianity is true or not, although I will have a hard time reconciling it with Genesis. Also, just because we reject the idea of evolution over millions of years doesn't mean we reject everything that science says. I am allowed to agree and disagree with science, just like you are allowed to agree and disagree with me. Science is being run by humans, and humans make mistakes. So now I will give you the main problem I have again, and keep in mind that evolution is a lot more complicated than this. However, what I'm going to point out is the foundation of evolution, and if the foundation isn't solid, then how can we trust everything that builds on top of the foundation? From everything that we have read so far, we only have the observational fact that animals change a little bit over time, and I totally agree with that. However, mixed in with this is the idea that all life came from a common ancestor, and they use mutations and natural selection and so on to explain how this happened. The point is, no matter what scientists tell you about evolution, it will probably just be this observational fact, which they are extrapolating beyond what we observe. So now, with that in mind, there is this idea that is usually presented by creationists in a debate that I want to point out to you. And this is the idea that there are two kinds of evolution: macroevolution and microevolution. However, I think that these two terms are a bit sloppy in describing what we mean with this. And the other problem is that science uses these two terms in different ways from the way creationists use them. So, let me give you the idea and I will assign new names to them in order to avoid this confusion. Microevolution in science is used to refer to the microscopic changes in an organism. So, for example, the evolution of the genes in an organism. The way creationists use this term is by saying that, well, we only observe changes in a specific population. So let's say, for example, the African bush elephant. And then over time, these changes might add up to such a point that we have different species of elephants. However, both of these species of elephants are still elephants, and so evolution only occurred within this population of animals, and these two different populations that emerge from this one are still the same kind of animal. So I will refer to this idea as species evolution. Macroevolution in the science is used to refer to the visible changes of an organism. So a parent elephant might have, for example, longer tusks than its offspring. However, the way creationists use this term is to say, well, we know that elephants in a population change. However, they still stay elephants. What we need for evolution is to observe an elephant changing into a different kind of animal. Say, for example, a whale or a hippo. And so from this argument, they say that macroevolution doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen observationally. I will be referring to this idea as kind evolution. The whole point of pointing out these two different things is to show you that all that we have observed from Darwin until modern civilization is species evolution. And what we have never observed is kind evolution, which is always mixed in with species evolution to give us the idea of a common ancestor. These two ideas seem very similar, however, I hope you can see that there is a big difference between the two. And it's important to notice this difference because it will change the conclusions you draw. A common objection that I have heard before is that, well, if animals can change from generation to generation, what is stopping them from changing from one kind of animal into another kind of animal over millions of years? For example, what is stopping an ape from evolving into a human over thousands of generations? Well, here is my objection to that. These scientists know a lot about genes. In fact, they even use it in the definitions, as you saw. But what they don't realize is that what is stopping this process from happening is genes. For example, there is no gene in the human genome that would allow us to grow feathers, as far as we know, obviously. Therefore, there is this natural barrier in the genes that we need to admit exists. Now, let's think about another problem logically. For evolution to happen as they teach us in school, there has to exist some kind of creature that came into existence by some unknown process, and then this creature would have to build up its protein coding genes from 1 or 2 letters long to at least 500 letters, and in some case up to 2.3 million letters long. And as I will show you now, this creature might have had to start off with a lot more than that. Otherwise, it was probably not able to live, which obviously then creates a bigger problem. Another problem that I also want to point out is that we have no evidence that life can form from non-living materials. You would think that if life can be created from non-living material all by itself, by nothing other than chemistry, it would be so easy for scientists to recreate this process. And we would just be able to restart evolution all over again today. The first experiment that attempted to prove this was the Urey-Miller experiment. This was apparently a huge success because they were able to create organic molecules from non-organic molecules. There is a bit of a problem though. They make it seem like it was this huge success and a big leap forward into our understanding of how the first life form got into existence. However, I think it is quite obvious that organic molecules are not alive. All this has proven is that we can create molecules using chemistry. I've even seen on Google that they said they have found organic molecules on meteorites and space rocks, which to me makes their case even worse. Because all this has proven is that we as humans are able to do what nature itself can do. So if they are going to claim that nature itself can create life from non-living materials, then it should be quite easy for them to do exactly the same. Now look at this article trying to answer the question of whether or not humans can create life. In only the second bullet, it totally misrepresents what the Urey-Miller experiment was about and what they achieved. And they immediately try to make up for these lies in the third bullet. I don't know if they were just simply trying to make their case look better, but if they wanted to represent this experiment accurately, they would have just simply left out the second bullet and then used the third bullet to explain what happened in that experiment. Then point 4 says that with the current advancements in technology, scientists can't create life yet. Then in the very next bullet, they say that scientists were able to create a strand of bacteria that was alive and could reproduce. All of these bullet points are just so contradicting to each other. The reason I'm showing this article to you is to point out a very obvious case where they are mixing in facts that are completely false with facts that are true to make their case look better. And it makes it seem like creating life is much more plausible than it actually is. Also, I thought it would be interesting to quickly take a look at the bacteria experiment they pointed out in this article. This article makes it seem like they created the bacteria from scratch and that it lived. However, what they really did in this experiment was to take an already living bacteria, change its DNA, and then reinsert that DNA into the same bacteria. But importantly, they did the inserting of the DNA piece by piece because it wasn't possible to insert the whole of the DNA at once. Then, they also said that this bacteria was living, but that it was reproducing much slower than it usually does, and these bacteria were oddly shaped. So, what does this experiment really prove? One thing that it definitely does not prove is that humans can create life. It only proves that humans can change life, probably for the worst, which again makes their situation even worse, because it just proves that we as humans can do what nature itself can do. The point is, it is very important that you take anything that science tells you about the creation of life with a pinch of salt, because chances are they are just overblowing their findings to make their case look better than it actually is. Then, as promised, I want to quickly take a look at another article that I found. This one was about creating a bacteria with the minimal amount of genes needed for it to live. I bet that you cannot guess the amount of genes that were necessary for the bacteria to stay alive. Well, according to this article, it was 473 genes. To me, this fact alone proves that it is impossible for life to be created by itself from non-living materials. Because if a bacteria, one of the most simplest life forms that we know, needs at least 473 genes to live, then it is impossible for this original life form to start off with 473 genes in order to live. To make matters worse, 31% of the genes that they had to keep in the bacteria, they don't even know what the function of it is. Another thing that they also point out in the article is that all of the genes that they had to keep in the bacteria had some kind of function to serve in the bacteria. And they mention 3 of these functions: reproduction, sustain cellular structure, and maintain the cell's metabolism. So think about this logically real quick. Those things are all necessary for life to exist. So the first organism, whatever it might be, had to have at least all of these functions already coded for in its genes. And if we just said that the minimal amount of genes that are needed is 473, I think the probability of this happening by itself is very close, if not equal to 0. Anyways, I thought that those few articles were very interesting as I started dabbling around in my research for this video. But I will leave the origin of life at that, and you can decide for yourself what you want to do with that information. Let's now, for the final part of this video, talk about evolution practically. I want us to use all of the theory that we just learned in this video to see if we can't try and figure out how one kind of animal can change into another kind of animal. So let's for now assume that life already exists on Earth. As you will see in one of the inconsistency videos that I will publish on this channel soon, snakes had legs according to science around 150 million years ago. but they then lost these legs because the genetic code that develops these limbs are simply switched off. And just to say, I would consider a snake with legs and a snake without legs two different kinds of animals. Now, if you think about this practically, there's only one of two things that can really happen in this situation. Either there was one single snake around, let's say, 80 million years ago that was born without legs from its parents that had legs. So the change had to happen from one generation to the next. Or the other situation is that this was a gradual process. Now, I think it's obvious that most people will say that this had to have happened with a gradual process, because that is what evolution teaches. But let's take both scenarios into consideration. First, let's assume that it happened from one generation to the next. According to the evolutionary processes that we have talked about, this mutation where the snake has no legs probably would not survive for very long in a population, because either this snake would just starve to death because it doesn't have the tools that it has now in order to catch prey and kill it, for example its muscle strength to strangle the prey or its venom to kill the prey, or this snake would just simply not be able to move. Now let's assume that the snake was able to survive despite all of these things that I just pointed out. There is still the problem that the snake probably won't be able to reproduce, because it will either not be able to find a mate because all of the other snakes in the population have legs whereas this one doesn't, and even if he does find a mate, it would probably be very difficult for them to reproduce because their reproducing habits would be dependent on their legs. Now let's say that the snake was able to overcome all of this and was even able to reproduce some children. This snake's offspring would probably just have legs again, because the leg gene is just switched off instead of it being completely gone. So, as you can see, there are a lot of problems that the snake would have to overcome and would probably be killed off through natural selection, the exact process that is supposed to cause evolution. Then, let's consider the other scenario. Let's assume that this happened as a gradual process over millions of years. Considering natural selection, those that survive in a population of animals will pass on their traits from one generation to the next. For this process to occur, these snakes' legs would have to get shorter and shorter from generation to generation. But let me ask you this question: what advantage will shorter legs bring to the snakes? I think it's pretty obvious that longer legs will give a bigger advantage, and so the snakes with the longer legs will be selected for. Then let's assume again that this gradual change to shorter legs is the case. Why in this case would the snakes have a leg gene that is just switched off instead of a leg gene that is switched on but just codes for very short legs? So short in fact that they are basically gone. I think that if you want to defend evolution as an explanation for what we observe, there are a lot of problems that you need to be able to overcome. And I think the logic that I used in this last part of the video makes a lot of sense, and if you think that it does not make any sense, I would love to hear about it in the comment section. But I think this one simple example makes life very difficult for the evolutionist. Okay. So with all of that said and done, let's summarize evolution and the problems I have with it. Evolution was originally the idea that every living creature looks different from their parents. However, this is inflated to the idea that all life came from a common ancestor. I have a problem with this because all we observe is one kind of animal bringing forth the same kind of animal. So an elephant is still an elephant from generation to generation. However, at some point, due to these changes and the places they go for survival, that gives rise to different species of elephants. But that can never be used to justify the idea that elephants and whales have a common ancestor. Then, although the Big Bang, evolution, and abiogenesis are three different theories, they all depend on each other. For example, evolution requires the existence of life, But as I think I have shown, there is no evidence to suggest that life can be created from non-living materials. So unless you say that God created the common ancestor, there is no justification to believe that this can be done through nature. And if you do make that assumption, then evolution would just be totally unnecessary. Because if you can assume God to create the common ancestor, why can't you just assume that God created all of the animals as we see them today? And then lastly, even if there was this common ancestor that already existed, evolution has a lot of other problems to deal with as well, which in my opinion is devastating to evolution and probably will never be solved. So there you have it, my brothers and sisters. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you got some useful information out of it. As I think is very clear by now, we as creationists should believe in species evolution, because that is an observable fact. However, there is no reason to believe in kind evolution because that has never been observed. Although I haven't talked about this in this video, species evolution is actually a very good explanation for the things we read in the Bible. But more on that in some other videos. If you have some interesting thoughts on this topic, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to have a few constructive conversations about this. If you would like to see more of the content that I produce, the YouTube algorithm thinks that you will like this video a lot. So if you would consider watching it, I would really appreciate that. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I shall see you in the next one. Cheers!